An ordinary day at play school began with the usual noise and chatter. Peppa and her friends were drawing, laughing, and playing. Susie Sheep, as always, was nearby, sharing her pencils. Peppa was drawing her house, big and cozy, with bright windows and a smoking chimney. George, sitting at the next table, meticulously drew lines, creating his own masterpiece. Everything was as it should be, but Peppa suddenly felt a slight tingling at the back of her neck, as if someone invisible was watching her. She looked around but saw no one unusual, only the familiar faces of her friends and teacher. She attributed it to tiredness, but the unpleasant feeling didn't disappear. At home, Peppa noticed that her reflection in the mirror seemed somehow alien. It mimicked her movements, but the eyes in it appeared duller, and the smile strained. She blinked, and the reflection blinked back, but with a slight delay, as if reluctantly. Peppa ran her hand over her face, and the reflection did the same, but her hand in the mirror looked paler, almost transparent. It was strange and a little frightening. She tried to shake off this feeling, but it clung to her like invisible dust. She started looking in mirrors more often, trying to catch this subtle difference, but each time her reflection seemed either normal or alien again. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig noticed that Peppa had become thoughtful and often stared at herself in the mirror for a long time. They tried to talk to her, asking if everything was all right, but Peppa just waved them off, saying everything was fine. She couldn't explain her feelings to them, as it would sound too strange. How to tell them that your own reflection is becoming alien? They just exchanged worried glances, attributing it to age-related changes or simply a bad mood. But Peppa knew it wasn't true. She felt something changing inside her, and it was connected to what she saw in the mirror. Peppa began to avoid mirrors. She tried not to look at her reflection, but it seemed to haunt her. In shop windows, in puddles after the rain, even in George's eyes. Everywhere she saw this barely noticeable, yet so frightening difference. Her reflection became more and more detached, its smile more and more empty. Sometimes it seemed to her that it was looking at her reproachfully, as if accusing her of something. It was unbearable. One morning, Peppa woke up feeling unusually light. She approached the mirror and her heart froze. The reflection was perfect. Her eyes shone, her smile was sincere, and her movements were smooth and natural. But something was wrong. It wasn't her. It was what lived in the mirror, and now it had taken her place. She tried to scream, but only a quiet alien laugh escaped her throat. Her hands, once so familiar. Peppa lay on the top bunk of her bunk bed, listening to George tossing and turning below. His breathing was erratic, unusually heavy for a sleeping child. She tried to sleep, but the unease grew with every strange rustle from beneath her. Morning brought only more questions. At breakfast, George sat staring at his bowl of porridge, his gaze empty and detached. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig exchanged glances, their smiles gone, replaced by a slight anxiety. Peppa tried to talk to George, but he didn't answer, only shaking his head slightly. At the playground, George sat in the sandbox, his small hands mechanically sifting sand, but his eyes remained lifeless. He didn't respond to Peppa's calls, to her attempts to engage him in play. In the evening, as her parents discussed his strange behavior, George sat in the corner of the room, engrossed in drawing. Peppa came closer and saw that he was sketching strange, repetitive symbols on paper. Circles, triangles, squares. They were perfectly even, almost mechanical. Peppa's anxiety intensified. She tried to show the drawings to her parents, but they were too busy with their own affairs, dismissing her. The next day, Susie Sheep came to play. George sat next to her, but his eyes were empty, and he didn't participate in their games. Susie looked confused and a little scared. Peppa looked at George, and it seemed to her that he was looking directly at her, but without any expression, as if through her. Later, when Peppa tried to talk to Susie about George, she also seemed detached, her gaze as empty as George's. Peppa felt the world around her begin to change. At the playground, she saw that other children, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, were also sitting with the same empty, detached stares. It was like a silent epidemic. Peppa walked home, feeling completely alone and frightened. The sky was overcast with grey clouds, and the house seemed alien. Entering the living room, she saw Mummy and Daddy sitting on the couch. They were watching television, but their eyes were as empty as George's and the other children's. Peppa tried to reach out to them, but they didn't respond. Their faces were lifeless masks. Peppa ran to her room. She sat on the floor, surrounded by George's drawings, which now seemed like ominous omens. The room plunged into darkness, and Peppa felt despair engulf her. She fell asleep, but sleep brought no relief. She dreamed of shadows in red suits. Peppa and George were playing in their room. George was sitting on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed looking at his car, and Peppa was on the top bunk drawing. Mummy Pig was cooking, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Suddenly, the telephone rang. Mummy Pig picked up the phone, and her face darkened. She spoke quietly. The conversation ended, and Mummy Pig went over to Daddy Pig. They exchanged worried looks. Peppa came down and came over to them. "What's wrong?" Peppa asked. Mummy Pig hugged her, but there was no warmth in her embrace. "It's okay, dear, just problems at Daddy Pig's work," she said, but her eyes said otherwise. Daddy Pig became withdrawn. His laughter disappeared, and his eyes became empty. He sat for hours staring at one point. George began to change too. He stopped playing with his cars and just sat next to Daddy Pig, mimicking his movements. Peppa felt fear creeping up on her. She tried to talk to Susie Sheep, but she just waved him away. Pedro Pony and Rebecca Rabbit seemed distant too. One evening, as Peppa lay on her top bunk, she heard strange sounds coming from her parents' room. It was a low, monotonous whispering that seemed to penetrate the walls. She went downstairs and to the door. The whispering grew louder, and Peppa could make out individual words. They were instructions, repeated over and over. She couldn't understand the meaning, but she felt that it was something ominous. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The door opened, and Mummy Pig stood there. Her eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them. She just stared through Peppa. "Mummy?" Peppa whispered, but there was no answer. Mummy Pig walked past her, heading towards the kitchen. Peppa followed her. In the kitchen, Mummy Pig began rearranging the dishes in a strange, unnatural order. There was no emotion or thought in her eyes, just emptiness. Peppa turned around and saw Daddy Pig and George standing in the doorway. Their faces were as blank as Mummy's. They were looking at her but not seeing her. These were not her family. They were just shells without a soul. Peppa tried to run away, but her feet were rooted to the floor. Their empty eyes hypnotized her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She saw her hands begin to move as mechanically as Mummy Pig's, her eyes becoming just as blank. The last thing she saw was her own reflected look in George's eyes, as blank and lifeless as everyone else's. Peppa Pig's house continued to stand in the sun, but now it was filled not with laughter, but with silence, which was more terrible than any scream. A sunny day at Peppa Pig's house suddenly darkened as clouds covered the sky. Peppa was playing in her room with her favorite doll, but something felt wrong. Strange shadows flickered outside the window. A soft knock echoed at the door, like someone scratching with claws. At the doorstep stood a large white rabbit in a pink jumpsuit with a triangular mask on its face. Its eyes glowed red through the mask's slits. The rabbit extended a bright postcard to Peppa showing children's games. The postcard depicted swings, slides, and carousels, but something about these drawings seemed sinister. The colors were too bright and the shadows too dark. Peppa took the postcard with trembling hooves and read the invitation to fun games for children. The rabbit nodded and vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving only the smell of damp earth and withered flowers. Mummy Pig entered the room and saw the postcard in Peppa's hands. Her face paled as she read the text. She knew these games weren't as fun as they seemed, and that children who went there sometimes never returned. Despite Mummy's warnings, Peppa decided to go to the games with George. They secretly snuck out of the house while their parents slept. The moon shone with cold light, and the wind whispered strange melodies through the tree leaves. The children arrived at a large clearing where other rabbits in pink jumpsuits awaited them. In the center stood a giant doll with empty eyes that slowly turned its head, watching every movement of the children. The main rabbit in a black mask announced the rules of the first game: red light, green light. But when someone moved on red light, a horrible creaking sound echoed, and that child disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the echo of their scream. Peppa realized she was trapped when she saw her friend Susie Sheep disappear. The doll's eyes glowed red, and the rabbits began slowly approaching the remaining children, making strange sounds like laughter and crying combined. George cried and hid behind Peppa when he realized the games hadn't ended as they expected. The rabbits surrounded them, their masks beginning to glow with an eerie pink light in the darkness, casting nightmarish shadows on the ground. At the last moment, Mummy and Daddy Pig appeared with flashlights, chasing the rabbits away. They hugged their children and led them home, explaining that not all invitations are safe, and that they should always listen to parents when they warn about danger.